So, yeah. Hello and welcome everyone to this Science and Society Network seminar entitled Toward Community-Based Heat Adaptation with Aalok Khandekar. I'm Emma Koval. I am a co-convener of the Science and Society Network, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we are now, the Wurundjeri people and the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd like to welcome our in-person audience and also our online audience. To those who are on YouTube, you can please participate in the chat. You will need to sign in to be able to participate in the chat, and then feel free to introduce yourself and ask any questions that you have as we're going through. And Karina Traits, our wonderful coordinator, can pass on those questions during question time. So if you haven't logged on to us before or been here before, it's the Science and Society Network, which is the interdisciplinary engine for research at Deakin. And we run a very exciting seminar series, as well as support the earlier and mid-career researchers at Deakin to do really exciting interdisciplinary projects. And I think all that's left to do right now is to introduce our speakers. So I'll introduce both Aalok and also our two discussants. So a really signature part of our SSN seminars is that we have a discussant, broadly one from the sciences and one from the social sciences, although of course there's a lot of blurring and overlapping between those categories. So I'll introduce both of those discussants, and after Aalok is finished, they'll then both give their initial responses and questions and issues that were raised for them from the seminar, and then we'll go to questions from our audience. Okay, so our speaker for today is Aalok Khandekar, who's Associate Professor of Anthropology and Sociology at the Department of Liberal Arts and affiliated faculty at the Department of Climate Change, both at the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT, in Hyderabad. Aalok's recent work has focused on two major themes: climate change and vulnerability in the urban global south, and second, research cultures and infrastructures to support collaborative and transdisciplinary scholarship. Aalok serves currently as the Editor-in-Chief of Engaging Science, Technology and Society, or ESTS, which is an Diamond Open Access Journal of the Society for Social Studies of Science. And I've worked alongside Aalok Khandekar for quite a few years through the Society for Social Studies of Science, also through a group called TransAsia STS that we started a few years ago. Especially, it was a real COVID lifesaver for many of us as well, to keep the hope alive and support our early career researchers across the region during that period of time. So it's really wonderful to welcome you here to Deakin today. So after Aalok finishes, as I mentioned, we've got two discussants. So first we'll have Associate Professor Rob, of course, I know I just can't say it at all.
Faggian.
Faggian, of course. We discussed it before, and then if you overthink it, it always goes bad. Okay. Rob Faggian is a climate adaptation expert and biologist with many years of experience in applied science, research translation and strategic sustainability planning. And he leads the Sustainable Regional Development Specialism within Deakin's Master of Sustainability program. And also is honorary professor at a university in Uruguay, has done a lot of work in Latin America, as well as across Australia, Asia and Europe as well. So he'll be bringing his expertise as Associate Professor of Climate Change Adaptation. Then we will have Professor Sujatha Raman, who is from the Australian National University in Canberra. And Sujatha is both the UNESCO Chair in Science Communication and for the Public Good, a flagship program exploring transformative ways of bringing science, technology and innovation to bear on the UN 2030 and post-2030 agendas. She is also Director of the Centre for Public Awareness of Science. She's Associate Editor of the Journal for Responsible Innovation and also Engaging Science, Technology and Society, and many, many other things. But if we did the full bios, that would be the whole time taken up. So we'll leave it there for the introduction, and we will. I'll hand over to Aalok. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. Should we start?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Emma, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to visit colleagues here at Deakin in the first place. Thanks, Karina, for organizing, and really, it's a real pleasure to be here today. What I'm going to be speaking about for the next 30 minutes or so is work we have been doing in Hyderabad for quite some years to think about the impact of rising temperatures on vulnerable population groups. In our context, that is meant to think about especially the impacts of heat in informal settlements or urban slums with specific kind of characteristics. And I'm really pleased to have both Robert and Sujatha here as discussants, because as hopefully will become apparent over the course of the talk, this is an extremely interdisciplinary effort, and much of my talk is actually going to focus on bringing out the interdisciplinary nature of the work that went into trying to understand heat somewhat holistically, and some of the insights that we have managed to get in the process. Okay? And so in that sense, I'm not thinking about this as a very conceptual talk, but really focusing on bringing out the empirics to some extent, and bringing out just the effort that went into this work. This comes out of an ESRC funded project, which was called Cooling, which is part of a project which was in response to a call that focused on the off-grid city. And so essentially thinking about populations and population groups that do not have reliable access to the urban grid in some ways. And I'll say what that means in my context in just a little while. So I'm titling the talk Cooling in a Fractal Grid Towards Community-Based Heat Adaptation in Hyderabad's Informal Settlements. So just to set up some of the context, I'm sure much of this is familiar for many in the room, but thinking about urban climate change especially, there is increasing kind of recognition about cities as particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and thinking especially cities in the LMIC countries that are rapidly growing, rapidly urbanizing, but also in a way that enhances the climate risk. Right? And as you can see in the image in the background, which is the field site where I've been like most active in, and I'll say some more about it. At least a big part of the risk in this context comes from the built environment itself and the way the built environment is configured in spaces like these. And obviously, yes, of course, also the way then the built environment is inhabited in these kinds of spaces, right? So part of what I'm going to be drawing out is both of these things, right? But what you see essentially is a place where a settlement which is built with a lot of temporary kinds of construction materials, right? And part of what enhances the risk in these spaces, the heat risk in these spaces, is that material quality of that space. Yeah? I'll say a little more about it in just a little while. Right? The broader context, right? To think about like India as especially South Asia and India as especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And for us, this comes in two forms. One is the rising frequency and rising intensity of heat waves. The second one is extreme rainfall and both enhanced risk of drought as well as flooding that comes from altered monsoon patterns in the region. Okay? And this recognition of India and South Asia being vulnerable to the impacts of heat, in my case, now that has been around for quite some time, right? And it has been receiving some attention, quite some attention, both nationally as well as internationally. Also attention to like, we haven't necessarily have had to make a very strong case or for the fact that heat risk is unequally distributed. That in some ways has been an awareness that has been at least present from the beginning, right? From the very outset, if you look at all the policy documents that are coming in, you do see that there is recognition of the unequal kind of distribution of heat risk, right? What has happened in the response to it is a different question, but at least there's the acknowledgement that the risk that comes from changing climate is not equally distributed. In India, in response to a deadly heat wave in the year 2010 in the city of Ahmedabad in Western India and Gujarat, was because of the excess kind of mortality and morbidity that results from the heat wave. Ahmedabad became an early player in terms of proactively figuring out what do you do with heat waves, right? So Ahmedabad subsequently developed and published the first ever heat action plan in the country in 2013. It's the first plan in South Asia and also the first of its kind in the developing world, right? So a lot of international agencies then also champion it as an exemplar of here is how countries that are resource poor like might still be able to proactively plan in response to might undertake climate responsiveness. In India itself, this plan scales up quite rapidly from one heat action plan in 2015. There is now about 40 different heat action plans, at least across the country and counting, which focus on the city scale. They might focus on at the level of the state, or they might focus on entire regions in the country, which are known to be vulnerable to heat, right? So in some sense, it's been a space that actually has gotten attention quite readily and has been recognizable heat quite readily. Right? Just to say a little bit more about the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan, right? What it does, yeah, like so because of the 2010 heat wave, the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan is essentially a number of local actors coming together, the municipal corporation, the Public Health Foundation of India, championed also through resources by the NRDC, receives money first from Canada and I believe eventually from the Netherlands as well, to think about characterizing in a fairly granular kind of fashion what heat risk in the city looks like and what kinds of measures might be put in place in order to govern govern heat risk, right? How do we prepare ourselves? So development of early warning systems, for example, specialized training to the healthcare professionals, particular attention to um, uh, particular attention to vulnerable groups, outdoor construction workers, for instance, or people, or the elderly, small kids who we know who we know to be more at risk. So some of this gets detailed, studied and detailed quite a lot in relation to the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan. There are scientific publications that come out of it, but also very proactive kind of public engagement and pushing out the Ahmedabad experience, right? So how do other cities like replicate the Ahmedabad experience, and how do we scale up this particular way of thinking about or addressing heat? So one thing that they developed, for instance, is the City Resilience Toolkit, right, which is a downloadable kind of document that you can go, and the link is right here. You can download the toolkit, and it really becomes a how-to checklist for how like cities and actors might adopt the heat action plan to their own kind of context. And this kind of enthusiastic kind of publicity, I think, in part explains why the plan becomes so prolific and why so many people try to replicate this experience. The plan and the idea especially resonates really well with the National Disaster Management Authority. And so heat still lives, or like primarily is something that is the Disaster Management Authority is responsible for, but the disaster management folks like really push it and also mandate that places in the country that we know are vulnerable to additional heat really think about how to govern it in their own spaces. Right. So in a recently kind of published analysis, I think this is 2 summers ago now, of the kinds of things that get proposed under the heat action plan, right? What kind of interventions, at what level? They might be nature-based solutions, they might be behavioral adaptations, it might be paying attention to the infrastructure of the city, and so on. How do you disseminate information? What channels of information dissemination make sense, and so on. So you see that there is it's an active space, right? And with a number of different kinds of things that are being proposed and that are being experimented with, right? Nonetheless, right, what does end up happening, right, with the Ahmedabad experience? And again, like this is an ongoing discussion. Heat still continues to receive a lot of attention in India, which means that this is an evolving space in terms of how it plays out. But at least the initial kind of mandate of the Ahmedabad plan to replicate like heat governance across the country means that there's a lot of bodies, a lot of people who are responsible for planning, who don't necessarily have the resources for planning or the expertise for planning, right? Which means that the Ahmedabad model essentially gets replicated to different parts of the country without a lot of attention to local kind of specificities, right? And so the plan for, so this is the plan for the state of Telangana, which is where I'm coming from. You would be hard pressed to find how different it is from the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan. What about Hyderabad, or what about Telangana is different from Ahmedabad is not something that you would readily find in that particular document, right? And the understanding of vulnerability in the process also gets quite impoverished, right? It's limited to thinking about mortality and morbidity overlaid with potentially the temperature profiles of particular places. But the finer granular understanding of what vulnerability actually looks like is somehow lost in this process of scaling up. So when we start thinking about heat action plans as the document, as a place where thermal governance is articulated, like I make 3 observations. Right? One of them is that what happens in the process is we get heat itself gets institutionalized as a disaster with particular kinds of implications, right? It means that on the one hand, it's important to be recognized as a disaster to mobilize resources. On the other hand, heat as a chronic problem rather than something that is a that is episodic and very acute at particular moments in time is not something that gets attention. Heat as something that can be quote unquote a slow disaster, right? Is not something that is readily recognized in this way, which means a lot of the structural kinds of conditions that predispose some to be more vulnerable to the impacts of heat are simply not um, are simply not uh, uh, admissible in this way of thinking, right? And so thinking about how the quality of the built environment, for instance, right, and something how the city is planned, right, and how that might enhance heat risk is not something that necessarily gets a lot of space in these. Although there is, again, urban planning is something that is now slowly beginning to make a greater kind of presence in these conversations, right? Second, from the perspective that I've been thinking about, is that it remains largely disconnected from the everyday kinds of realities and the everyday geographies in which these heat action plans are implemented, and what is making people a particular group of people vulnerable to is not something that is readily kind of visible and through these kinds of through this way of making sense of heat. Right? And importantly, like also thinking about the ways in which many groups are already adapting to heat, not something that needs to be done in the future, but many of the interventions that are already underway in a very kind of in a very everyday kind of manner as well, right? Changes in clothing, changes in diets that are deeply rooted cultural habits, right? That people just do because that's what they've learned for generations, or minor adaptations to their houses, temporary adaptations to their houses. Like all of these remain largely kind of invisible from absent from these documents, right? And so in some ways they're inventing heat adaptation new rather than building on top of what already is. Right? So that's one portion of my talk, which is largely looking at how heat has been conceptualized as a problem and what maybe some of its limitations are, especially from the perspective that we've been thinking about it. I'll move on to thinking about talking about the actual research we have been doing in terms of understanding heat in very at the granular kind of at the very micro neighborhood level understanding of heat. What you're seeing in front of you is a rendering of how the land use patterns in the particular neighborhood that we have been engaged in has changed over the course of the past 3 decades or so. And this is the this is largely the part where I'm going to focus. I'm going to tell you a story about this part. Although in this more organized kind of end of the image is also we've been working, right? What you're seeing in front of you is a settlement that came up starting somewhere in the 1990s. It's essentially a piece of land that has been encroached upon, right? Because the land itself firstly got opened up for building residential middle-class residential communities, but it quickly got caught up in litigation, right? And the litigation is still at a stalemate, which means that there has not been any official kind of authorization to build anything on the piece of land, right? This is when migrants into the city, especially local migrants in the city, like start encroaching upon this land, and over time, like incrementally build up to the space that you see in front of you, right? Which means in part that people occupying this land have no land tenure, right? And one of the biggest kind of limitations in terms of any kind of interventions ends up being because people themselves don't feel secure on the land on which they are living, don't really want to make any heavy financial investments into the land, even if they have the means to, right? So that's one of the things that like really that becomes a key kind of defining challenge in this instance. Nonetheless, I mean, and if you follow like how cities in India and in the global south have largely developed, over time, people do start thinking of, like about start having a greater sense of ownership, a greater sense of confidence over generations. Over time, they have a greater sense of ownership over the land. They don't fear eviction nearly as much as maybe newer entrants into the city. And so what you get is a hodgepodge of construction, like you see, right? There's um, some houses which will have like tarpaulin sheets, right? As like for their roofs. Many of them have these what are tin sheets for their roofs, right? So there's very few which will have actual concrete cement structures, right? Some of them will have concrete cement structures for their walls. Some of them will have been built entirely with these tin sheets, and some of them will like literally just have thin sheets as well as and tarpaulin roofs. Right? They also, for the similar reasons, they have a very kind of mixed and um, uh, inconsistent connection to the urban grid. Right? If you see in the image to the right, like you see the cover of a manhole. Right. So there is a sewage system that the city has put in place in this instance. There used to be piped water that was available in the community, right? But it got disconnected over time, right? As especially because of a court order, right? If you see some wires and you see electricity poles in the background, right? But all of that is illegally tapped into, so it's not a formal connection to the electric grid either, right? It's not as if the city doesn't know it, right? It will be very politically unpopular to like disconnect, right? But it's also impossible to regularize, right? People are willing to have their meters, right? Because that gives them access and a claim over the city, right? So they would be happy to have a metered connection, right? But giving them a metered connection would actually give them a greater claim over the piece of land, which becomes contentious. Okay? Water supply, similarly, right? On the one hand, the city can't deny inhabitants water, right? But piped water supply entails something different than what ends up happening in the place right now. Is you get water in the colony every other day through a water tanker, which then gets stored in these blue containers that you see lining the street, right? And that tanker, again, is something that the city provides, right? Because water in some ways is recognized as a basic right, right? But it's not piped water, right? Which means then somebody has to be around to actually collect the water and make sure that the family is looked after over family has access to water for the next 2 days, right? Here again, the role of community networks becomes really important, because if you can't be around to collect water on any given day, you have to depend on your neighbors to collect water for you. Or if you run out of water, you might have to borrow water from somebody else. Water, even more than electricity, is a really important resource in the context of heat, right? Because staying hydrated is important. The only techniques of cooling that make sense are based on evaporative cooling, all of which are water intensive. And so water and access to water and ensuring access to water is a really important kind of consideration in the context of heat in this instance. When it comes to the built environment, the other thing I'll just point out as a particular limitation in this instance is also if you have houses that are made of tin sheets, right? Especially if your walls are also of tin sheets, right? It means that you actually can't have windows in the house because it's impossible to cut windows in those sheets, right? Which means you actually lived in like these very closed off kind of spaces which make it extremely uncomfortable during the hot period. Yeah. So that's the satellite image of the space. And what happened is, like I said, over time, because people do get formal recognition from the city, this is what in popular, like in local language, this is typically referred to as the government housing. In response, sometime in the early 2000s, a fire broke out in the colony, which ironically meant, or paradoxically meant, that a lot of people converted from wooden and bamboo structures to the kind of materials that you see now. But some people got moved into government housing or low-income housing that got constructed. And so the kind of more grid-like housing that you see on the corner, that's government housing. And some people move from this settlement into some of those houses in the process. Okay, so what we have done then over a period of 2 summers, one was more a pilot kind of approach, pilot study over the hottest month, and then we have another year's worth of engagement in the community to actually understand the rhythms in the community and what happens, what changes in a response to heat in those communities over a period of 1 year. So we have some data that is somewhat longitudinal in nature as well. Right, and so some of the methods that we've used to comprehend heat include, and I'll describe each of them in some detail next, right, is to actually think about setting up a local kind of weather monitoring network in that space, trying to, through especially these time activity perception surveys, trying to understand how people have been changing, adapting their patterns over a period of a year. Something that has been kind of really exciting to do is also to model the colony from the ground up, and I'll say why we had to do that. And then trying to move out of these really kind of very localized settings into thinking about what would it mean to think about heat in the context of the city as a whole in the process too. So how do you go from individual neighborhoods to at least thinking about the city and how the city can respond. Okay. So the first one is in about 40 houses in the settlement. So we first go in the settlement. Eventually, we developed a typology of different kinds of houses that are present in the settlement. And these broadly, it will come up on the screen in a minute. They can broadly be thought of as kacha houses, as semi-pakka houses, and pakka houses. Kacha means temporary, pakka means permanent, and then there's the semi-permanent kind of structures, right? And so 3 broad kind of houses that are present in the colony, and along with then thinking about the orientation of the sun, especially which ones are south-facing, which are going to get hotter, and so where's the roof. And so thinking about both building material and orientation, we identified about 40 different houses in order to think about where heat is kind of like really making an impact. And inside those houses in different spaces that are just functionally separated. They're not actually different spaces. They are not different rooms, but they are functionally separated into a kitchen, maybe into a sleeping space, and so on. Set them up with these temperature and humidity loggers in the house, a weather station in the colony to think about what the ambient kind of temperature looks like in those kind of settings, and then eventually also trained volunteers within the community, right, to collect that data for us. So the loggers are there, and they know how to then extract the data from the loggers and upload it back to us. Right. All of this is kind of accessible in an open access kind of open source dashboard, but also just to create a data commons in the city, to make micro neighborhood level data more accessible than it is at present. And so the screenshot here shows you some of the visualizations that are possible with the data that we have been collecting. And lastly, this is then the typology of houses in this colony. The kacha houses, the semi-pakka houses, and the pakka houses. Right? what I would especially bring your attention to is what you see is in the top image, which is the temporary houses, which means 10 sheets and 10 or tarpaulin sheets. What you see is the indoor temperature very closely mirrors the outdoor temperature. Right? So the indoors is actually offering no shelter from the ambient kind of temperatures. Right? Whereas in the other two instances, what you see is the uh, in the Pakka house, you will see that it remains quite stable, but at the peak of the temperature, there is some insulation so the indoors temperature stays lower than the outdoor temperature during the peak heat moments. That's not true in the case of kacha houses. Right? Here is one instance where you see the failure of very standardized kind of approaches and standardized understandings of heat. So every single heat action plan in the country, for instance, is going to tell you that when it is too hot outdoors, stay indoors, right? And you have to shield yourself, you have to shelter yourself, you have to stay indoors, right? That actually ends up being bad advice in this instance, right? In a colony where majority of the people are actually staying in kacha houses, that's poor advice. People know that experientially. So people know that they shouldn't be staying indoors, and they'll probably seek out the small kind of open spaces in their neighborhoods with a little bit of green cover and so on. But that's experiential knowledge, which simply is absent from even city level planning. Right. So one set of data that we have now collected over an entire year is of just weather data that is quite localized. Then with about 40 respondents, we have conducted baseline surveys to try and understand socioeconomic kind of demographics, characteristics, and various kinds of parameters in order to just understand who the population group in this instance is. We have also conducted what are called time activity perception surveys that are basically thinking in a recall period of about 24 to 48 hours, asking people to recollect what they did, right, or the previous day or the day before. And we have kept going back to the same people every 3 or 4 weeks to collect these impressions. Right? So we have about, I say, 4,500 impressions of what people in this community did in relationship to the changing kind of weather around them, which we can also correlate to with the actual weather patterns in those communities. Right? And one of the things that predominantly comes out in the process is just how strongly gendered the experience of heat is, and the particular spaces. So if we think about the indoors as vulnerable, it was also very obvious from the data, not necessarily something that's surprising, but it is also very obvious from the data that it is disproportionately women who are much more indoors, and because both of cultural norms, because a lot of the work that they're doing tends to be indoors and so on, right? And so the disproportionate kind of distribution of heat risk, at least one axis along which it happens in the community like this, ends up being through because of is structured by gender, right? And you can variously visualize this data based on the work we have done to think about think about domestic activities, think about cooking, who is doing the cooking, comfort levels while cooking. And you see suddenly that jumps up, the discomfort jumps up suddenly in the month of May, which is the peak heat month in that part of the country, where if at all people are socializing and by gender, sleeping. Another thing that becomes really apparent in the data is people start to sleep poorly. The quality of sleep diminishes over the summer months. Right? And the level of comfort in general, like where people are feeling uncomfortable at different moments in time. Okay, so This is then a second set of a second entryway into thinking about how to understand what heat is doing. A third one becomes in relationship to the built environment itself, and here is where we have actually invested in developing or invested in the building information model, which very minutely characterizes the built space in terms of its material qualities, and then building on, and after that kind of characterization goes on to build to model what the heat gain in different kinds of spaces could be, right? So what houses, because of their particular material qualities, end up being hotter than others, and then potentially towards then thinking about simulating what kind of upgradation scenarios might make sense in spaces like this, right? What it has meant is to work again, like we have done a lot of this through training and through internships for our local architecture students and training them to do this work, which becomes a new kind of skill for them, which they don't commonly get to work with. But then, and actually going into the standard kind of softwares that you might use to do this kind of modeling. And one of the things you will find then is the material libraries, and that you can model them for cement much more readily, but tin asbestos as a building material would not necessarily be available, or polythene as a building material would not necessarily be available. So you have to hack into the libraries to input newer kinds of materials into this kind of into the software as well, right? And what you would get then is a building model like that identifies in a very kind of minute fashion models where the doors, the windows, where the openings are, what kind of materials, and so on, to then model. I won't say a lot about in the animation, just demonstrates the modeling of heat gain in the settlement, which is something that collaborators of mine have been doing. What I'll say, and what becomes interesting for us is what comes out of it, right? In the image at the bottom, what you see is a modeling of the heat gain for the three different kinds of houses that we just saw, the kacha houses, the semi-pakka houses, and the pakka houses. And what you see is, and what is potentially exciting is in this particular simulation, this is modeling the heat gain for the existing setup. This is modeling heat gain as if all the houses became pakka houses instead. So if the intervention that one proposes is to move from temporary to permanent housing materials, then this is what will happen. And this is essentially saying, what if we took the roofs and applied some reflective paint, what is called cooling paint, right, on the asbestos, on the tin sheet, and put a layer of insulation, right? And what you would see in the process is the heat gain in the kacha houses actually, because that's done on the logarithmic scale, the heat gain comes down substantially, right? So one, it is a low cost intervention, right? But what is also potentially exciting about that finding is that it doesn't change or it doesn't intersect with local politics at all, right? People are much happier if the interventions are temporary. But if you start thinking about building, making permanent structures, right, in a settlement, that would very quickly get contentious, right? And so the moving to a completely permanent kind of structure is also politically not feasible, right? Whereas the other one, which is also low cost, is it's possible to imagine implementing that and thinking about what happens. Right? So it's a temporary solution, but it certainly has some appeal in terms of at least getting some immediate kind of heat relief. And then what we have subsequently done is to move out of a specific neighborhood to think about what do slums in the city in general look like? What are different kinds of informal settlements, right? And we have again tried to classify them based on their built form, especially? Are they low-lying structures versus are they structures that are 2 or 3 story? Because that makes a considerable difference because there's a lot of mutual shading that happens if you have structures that are multi-story. So thinking about and so trying to at a somewhat more general scale try to identify the different kind of built forms that exist in this space and in the city. And then also, what would the heat gain and what would the experience of heat, like generally, not experience, but what would heat in those spaces generally look like? Right? Is another exercise that we have engaged in. Right. Lastly, then, to just highlight 2 more things. Right. One, on the image to the left, you're seeing 2 or 3 things that are particularly significant in the context of heat. Right, one of them is just the presence of shade and the importance of shade as something that is vital, again, as really important for thinking about what kind of spaces, what kind of interventions would make sense in the context of heat relief. Second is, the women in the image are actually peeling ginger in the first image. In the second image, the woman is peeling some garlic. And that is a very widespread economic activity that women in the community undertake in this instance. That's partly a function of limited mobility, right? That, again, prevailing cultural norms as such that not a lot of women work outdoors. But also then, if you are the one who is responsible for making sure that the family has water every day, your mobility is limited anyway. So both in response to both of them, even though this particular kind of activity might pay them less in comparison to even if they undertook domestic work in close by neighborhoods, it's something that they still would do, right? So, but that's also something that becomes a communal activity. That's not necessarily something that women will do in isolation in their homes, but that's where, at least preliminarily, what we think about in this context is that's where some of the maintaining the social networks that is really important for then subsequently pursuing heat relief is it happens through activities like this, and we think about it as a kind of FATEC labor in the way Julia Alecha has talked about it, right? And so the 2 kinds of things that are worth highlighting from this context is one, if you now turn back to the activity, the time, and the survey data that we have collected, you'll find many articulations of the kinds of things people are already doing, right, and that they know how to do in relationship to managing heat. It might be about how to dress appropriately for the weather. It might be about how consumption practices, dietary practices change according to season. Even traditional kind of herbal medicine and remedies around those that are again passed on to families. Much of that exists. A lot of them depend on local networks. Like if you have an electric fan or if you have an evaporative cooler, which also is rare, but many of them would rely on existing networks in order to repair them because breakdown is frequent. So, but a lot of that also happens at the level of the community, right? And so just to highlight that, one, there's a possibility of then thinking about, as opposed to thinking about heat predominantly as something that the state is responding to at an abstract level, it is possible to think about at least community-led, community-based interventions, right? But the other challenge that is worth highlighting then here is, in spite of all the alarm over heat, right, in the recent times, from the community perspective, from an everyday kind of perspective, people still don't think about it as a serious enough risk, right? And that's not so. I mean, even the woman, the image saying that why would I like even buy a desert cooler? Right? It's only 3 months. Right? We have dealt with heat. Like we live in a hot place. We have dealt with heat all our lives. Why would we do anything different right now? Right? And so part of the challenge then is there's a paradox there. One which on the one hand there is the possibility of thinking about community-led responses, but from the perspective of the community, it is not a serious enough problem. Right? Even in spite of this increasing kind of attention to heat and heat health and so on. Right. So maybe that's like that's some of I guess the other two things I want to highlight in the other image, right? In one again, you see the blue drums, the water drums in the image, they're pervasive. Anywhere in the colony you go, you will see the streets lined with blue drums, and it just really underscores the importance of thinking about paying attention to water. The other is religious institutions, right, and how they serve as community spaces in the absence of other spaces. So you see both a mosque and a temple right next to each other, and a lot of socializing that is happening is right in front of it. Right. Right. So let me just work towards towards conclusion. Highlight and this is just there's a lot of preliminary data that has been written up and published on the website heatingcities.in. So that's one place to look up. Much of the in some more detail, some of the things I've been talking about, and some of the publications that are coming out of this way. We have also been simultaneously then investing in thinking about developing how do you teach this material. Like there's a teaching module that's again available on the website to how to actually understand heat in this kind of multi-dimensional fashion. There's also, again, how do we think about feeding this back into the community itself? And so this is a manual for local masons who often build the space. I mean, all these houses that you see aren't like there are no formal contractors who are making these, but there's a lot of like informal labor that goes into the actual construction, right? And so what kind of like very basic techniques can you just highlight that might again not be resource intensive, but how do you formalize it? And this is a booklet that we have published in English and Hindi and Telugu. So I'm just also trying to and circulate it as much as possible. Paying attention to just like the built environment at a very granular kind of level. Yeah, these are some of the policy forums that we have been trying to push this work out into as well. And also quite an interest in really thinking more about the possibility of doing the kind of modeling work that we've been doing, and how do you, and it's also done in some of the actual the building information model itself happens in a proprietary kind of software, which is quite expensive to access. But the actual data collection and so on, in order to be able to do this kind of work, we have been trying to think about how do you do it in ways that are very, very accessible and can be replicated easily across different kinds of contexts. So it's and so there's this kind of technology development, and we have been talking about AI all morning. There's some interest also in at least just because of the different vast and different kinds of data that we have collected, right? It's images, it's videos, it's survey data, and so on, which is quite extensive. So there's at least some interest in thinking about, is there a possibility of cutting through the data and building like models for urban analysis that can work off like this kind of information, right? And I'll just leave us with then the last kind of this last kind of insight, which comes back to like how we have been thinking about this work from a more conceptual kind of space, is to think about southern cities as a distinctive kind of like urban formation, where certain kinds of approaches to research, certain kinds of approaches to policy making, which are essentially, as Gautam Bhana argues, they have to be incremental, they have to be rooted, but they have to be incremental, constantly adaptable, and so on. Right? And so we have been really trying to think about how to think about even policy in a way that is responsive to these kind of realities of life in the urban South. And so that's where I suppose the work will go, at least part of what we are interested in thinking about the work from that perspective. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aalok. That was a very interesting and informational presentation. I was scrolling notes frantically, so I'm going to run through some key insights for me. And for each of those, I've tried to relate it to the Australian experience. First, just by way of context, I do slightly similar work. So I look at the impacts of climate change on regional communities here in Australia. We do that through modelling and taking observations in the field. From that, we develop adaptation strategies and look at how we can sustain livelihoods. Some of the things that sprang out to me was the modular nature status of these policies, that they tend to fail in contexts of informality. So they're not necessarily designed for relevance, they're more designed for replication. So cookie cutter approach. We use the modular policy from this city and just apply it elsewhere. These standardized toolkits are built for scale, not necessarily for effectiveness. They erase local realities. We see the same thing here. Now, our context is, I think, a little bit similar in that we have climate adaptation guidelines, bushfire recovery plans, resilience frameworks. They often rely on a very templated logic, and they assume reliable data, institutional capacity, which is often not there, and uptake by local authorities. The reality is, as far as I see it, is the information is quite generic. It goes out to under-resourced councils who lack the capacity to implement any actions from those plans. Another thing that leapt out at me is that in your informal settlements, vulnerability emerges from social structures, not just from exposure to the hazard. So we have socioeconomic status, spatial marginality, gender. Australia's analogue is probably First Nations people, even climate-affected rural communities, aged renters, I think, probably fall into that category, or people in low-income suburbs in general, all face compounding risks. The other thing that I got from your presentation was that informality in terms of these suburbs is not necessarily a problem to be solved, but it is an adaptive system in itself. You have informal settlements and not necessarily governance voids, because you have people that are generating their own adaptive strategies. Australia, the context, and with respect to informalities, maybe a little bit more subtle, but we have informal caregiving networks, we have volunteer firefighting groups, we have communities pulling together during times of crisis, and policy tends to treat these as peripheral or maybe a liability type of situation because it's unstructured and not controlled. as opposed to an adaptive asset. The other thing I took from your presentation is that adaptation is quite gendered. So, from my own experience as well, working in developing countries, women in informal settlements bear the disproportionate burdens of climate risk. Again, I think we see echoes of this in the Australian context. So even though we have more formal gender equality in law, adaptation strategies rarely engage with gendered patterns of risk. So women dominate unpaid care work in this country, especially for children and the elderly. Single mothers are often locked into poor quality, high heat rentals, not to the same extent of high heat, but nonetheless. So just to bring it all together and try and bring it back to our context a little bit, I think as Australia's climate risks multiply, our governance systems will increasingly face many of the same contradictions as in your context. So templated tools that don't fit, vulnerabilities that are not captured by risk maps and risk assessments, informal systems doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of adaptation, gendered burdens. And you alluded to this, but I think we have the problem here as well of fragmented institutions. So you were talking about heat being lumped in with the disaster management agency. So to finish, I think the question is not what can we learn from this case study, but can we afford not to learn from this case study? Thank you.
So thank you very much, Aalok, for that really fascinating talk. So I too have scribbled various things. I'll try and make sense of, something. I think I want to make sort of 3 key points. Let's see if I can do that quickly. But first of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people. Also would like to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and benefit from their custodianship every day. So I think I might try and approach this from the perspective of somebody who has been thinking for the bulk of my career on how we do interdisciplinary research. How can we, what are the ways in which we can do it, but also what are the sorts of, concepts, what are the things that potential barriers maybe that we need to overcome in order for interdisciplinary research to be, to achieve its full potential, if you like. And it's, of course, something that we have been talking about in the context of the discussions, more informal discussions this morning. I know that SSN at Deakin is very much a leader in this space. So I come from a center which is in many ways one of the sort of earliest centers in the space of science communication. So it's fondly known as CPAS, Center for the Public Awareness of Science. But in different ways, I think we have been trying to, think maybe not necessarily using that language of interdisciplinary research, but very much thinking about trying to, embody that and figure out what it could mean in practice. So I'll make some maybe broader remarks. And so one of the things I was thinking about, inspired really by your talk, Aalok, was how we think about the role of different disciplines. So of course, when we talk about interdisciplinarity, it's a bit of a buzzword these days. And, very often in different parts of the world, including in Australia, there is, I think, an interest in bringing people from the more kind of STEM disciplines, as well as the HAS, humanities and social science disciplines together. I think in Australia, certainly in the context of these centers of excellence, it's often encouraged, particularly in that context. And I guess one of the things that I want to highlight which again, building on what you highlighted, what you have talked about, Aalok, is how very often in these sorts of collaborations, particularly in response to grand challenges, big challenge like climate change and climate adaptation, there's maybe a tendency to see culture as a barrier. And culture or embedded forms, culturally embedded forms of behavior as something to be modified, right? You highlighted that with the heat action plans. A fair bit of that is about behavior modification. And I think your work really kind of encourages us, prods us to think about culture as potentially a source of innovation, a source of creativity. Well, not just potentially, we know that creativity comes from culture, right? We can be quite confident, I think, in that. And I think perhaps that is a kind of an ethos and an understanding of culture that hopefully we can embody and try and promote in building these kinds of interdisciplinary collaborations. I would love to see more work along those lines. And I think your example really illustrates the importance of that. So that's one point about the role of different disciplines and particularly how we think about culture in that context. Maybe the second one is thinking about the kind of knowledge that is, often valued by, maybe kind of, more traditional forms of research funding, as opposed to, what the kind of more interdisciplinary collaborations are trying to promote, right? So what kind of knowledge that is. And I think, again, your work really beautifully illustrated how, really understanding what goes on in those contexts, in the, very place-based knowledge, it's essential. It's not, you cannot kind of downplay the significance of that, especially when, there's a tendency to kind of encourage, as you said, the kind of scaling up of knowledge, right? So the idea that, we want to produce knowledge from above, if you like a view from seeing from above. And I think, I think your case study, everything you talked about really kind of highlighted why that context is so critical. Even in two countries in India, there's different cultural norms, and we have to really sort of, I feel, get this point across for interdisciplinarity to flourish. For those of you who are interested in that kind of issue, the International Science Council recently we published a paper in collaboration with them, so the UNESCO chair and the International Science Council, which I'm afraid, I suppose, sort of highlights this as a problem. So the title of the paper is The Contextualization Deficit. So it's very much a kind of highlighting a problem, but hopefully I think work like yours illustrates that not all research is blind to the kind of context. Some people like you, doing work that's very kind of technically informed by science, engaging with science, engaging with technical stuff, if you like, but really deeply embedded in that contextual knowledge. So so that's maybe a second thing. And then finally, maybe to kind of wrap this up, I was really struck by what you talked about in terms of modeling and what was it called? BIM, I forgot the acronym, Building Information Modeling. I should remember that. My PhD was actually on building regulations, but it was from many years back. Maybe they used different acronyms then. Anyway, but I was so struck by how you talked about this as, so you can work with this contextual knowledge, but actually you can do that, you can build on that to do this kind of technical work, which is also essential, right? So I guess I was thinking about that as innovations in knowledge production, new ways of doing modeling, that exemplifies in many ways, I think, this interdisciplinary ethos we're thinking about, because it's both technical. I mean, all the artifacts from that work that you showed, I kind of really highlight the importance of technical expertise and technical knowledge, but at the same time is informed by that deeply contextual understanding and knowledge. So I think maybe that again, so for those of us who are really interested in promoting, practicing, doing more of interdisciplinary collaboration, I think there's a lot there to be inspired by, both in terms of, maybe just to summarize, thinking of culture as not just a barrier, as a source of creativity, thinking of what kinds of knowledge is valued, and really kind of, building on those kinds of examples that you've talked about. But then thirdly, really doing modeling differently or doing science differently as a result of these interdisciplinary collaborations. So thank you very much. I think I found that definitely found that very inspiring. And I hope we can think about some of those broader issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob and Sujatha. They were just really amazing, amazing comments. So we've got time for questions. So Aalok, I'll get you to come back up to address the questions. And I've got one to get us started. And it was around this, I would say, general theme of security. So I was struck with this idea of the sense of ownership that you talked about, and that how that influences experience of heat. But then you also showed us that categorization of temporary, semi-permanent and permanent houses. So on the one hand, I would kind of assume that having a greater sense of ownership means then you're going to, whether there's a legal basis for that or not, means that you'll invest in a permanent house. And the permanent houses did decrease the peak temperature, but they retain huge amount of heat overnight. So there's lots of questions I have, but do people sleep outside overnight? Because definitely working in Central Australia, as I have done in the past, people just sleep outside. But are there security concerns about that? And from a health perspective, if you're avoiding that really peak high temperature, but you're actually just got a much higher average temperature, is it actually benefiting you to have a permanent house? So I'll start with those questions.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you, Rob and Sujatha, both for your excellent comments, and I have some specific responses eventually to that as well. But maybe let's start with the permanent houses and what it does. So one, just on the health front, what we know less about and what's there, increasingly there's a lot of interest in it, not just in India, but around, in many contexts, is that we actually don't understand the health impacts of heat as much as well as we should. And there's a lot of effort being put into generating that kind of knowledge, including the Wellcome Trust, which puts out periodic calls around it. So in the context of this community, for instance, and it's difficult because causality is very difficult to establish in a context like this, right? And so in the case which complicates climate health quite in general. But if the disruption isn't, so if you, for instance, people will tell us if it gets too hot, a lot of men who do construction work, right? They might say that we don't have a choice because we are so replaceable that if we don't go to, if we take a break, then we'll just simply lose our jobs, which means they keep on going until one day they can't. And they say, if I feel very tired, I'll not go for a day or two, and then I'll go again. But if you actually then tried to look up medical records, right? Even at the local healthcare primary, it never would show as a problem to begin with, right? And so how do you set up how do you begin to understand heat health is a different kind of question that really needs a sustained kind of attention in this context. From a security, so outdoor sleeping in India used to be a thing. It is less of a thing. And once again, it is a very gendered thing, right? If at all, you would find men who would feel somewhat more comfortable being able to sleep outside, women wouldn't do it. And so that's one more place where this practice gets gendered. And the space itself, the space of the colony in this particular instance, is very different in daytime than it is at nighttime. And so there's even, I think, men would feel very apprehensive about wanting to sleep outside, even if it is uncomfortable inside. Like what it means, but if you have a permanent house, what it means that you potentially like would have like working fans, right? That's like, or ceiling fans, which happen in other instances too. You might have an evaporative cooler, which like substantially like alters the profile of the space indoors, which is simply impossible in some of the other spaces. Right? So yeah, that's the immediate kind of answer to the to that question. And I just saying, Sujatha, to your last comment, especially around. So I agree with like the comments that you both made were fantastic, and they resonate very, very readily. And I really appreciate like the pithy kind of takeaways that you offer in terms of here are 4 takeaways from your work. It's really great. For the last, like the builder information model is something maybe I didn't say it while I was doing the presentation, but that's a really excellent example of also what ground up kind of modeling would look like. And it started, we actually I don't have it in the presentation today, but there's this a drone image. We also flew a drone over the colony to capture like what the colony looks like. But because of all the assumptions that go into like, and we like constructed what like the slum in a 3D kind of model would look like, but it was both very inaccurate, and it certainly doesn't get at the building level like information that we would need, right? And so it just becomes like it very literally for us became a like really fancy visualization of what this looks like, but in practice very unhelpful, right? And then we also invested in some so we bought a very expensive computer, and like one of our research assistants did some like very intensive kind of modeling of this colony in a different kind of simulation environment. Every simulation run for analyzing that space like took us about a month, right? So you change something and the computer model would run for another month, right? It's computationally both time intensive and it's very cost ineffective, right? Which is what led us to then think about what is, especially if this is to be something that is more easily shareable, right? What is something that will actually give us meaningful information, but also something that can be then replicated in similar kind of low income kind of setting, right? And so now the actual building up of the model means that you buy a small camera that fits onto your that plugs into your phone, and you can literally walk around with that and like get a sense of what that space looks like from the inside. And in that sense, it becomes something that we potentially can think about what would it take, right, to try and generate this kind of understanding that is very place-based and intensely technical, but technical in a way I think that is informed by more STS kind of sensibilities.
Excellent. So, do we have some questions? Yeah. So yeah, Catherine.
Thank you. That was a brilliant talk and really fantastic discussion afterwards from both discussants. I was really struck by a theme that keeps coming up also in my own research around heat, around this contrast between the banality of heat and its everydayness and its continual placement within a disaster framework, when in fact it's the banality of it, as you say, that makes it particularly dangerous. And one of the things I've been interested in is thinking about the subclinical nature of heat and its impacts, and how subclinical impacts are often impossible to record, but they're the very foundations of the clinical ones. So the stress and heat stress is really interesting to me in thinking about chronic stress. And I think these sorts of projects like you're doing are capable of really capturing local understandings of chronic stress, what it means, whether it's, tiredness, grumpy kids, there's a whole lot of just everydayness that has a potential sort of way of making it's into the more acute language. But of course, health tends to measure only death and has a whole lot of sort of quite detached forms of language to talk about death from heat stress. I've just been working with the concept of early harvesting which is a really weird one on public health, which I find just so distressing as a concept to talk about death. But there's a very detached kind of mode of speaking about it within public health. So I think, what were some of the ways that you notice people talk about those everyday stresses of heat that might be able to inform a sort of a broader model that can work on biomedicine to recognise these subclinical dimensions?
Oh, that's a great question and great observation. Thank you. I don't have a very elaborate response necessarily, but I think the most obvious kinds of ways in which it has manifested, I think, is tiredness is certainly something that comes up quite a lot, and like people like eventually reporting that some days they don't go to work or something or the other. So tiredness resulting in like at least lost wages for a day or two. Like that might be one thing that comes up. Loss of sleep, like that comes up quite often. Like the quality of sleep diminishes, and there is some, and this is something I would say much more tentatively because we haven't looked at the data closely. I don't even know that we have the data for that as much. A limitation of how we went about collecting the data too. But I think what you would likely find in this instance is also increased incidence of domestic violence. And that's alcoholism is a pervasive kind of issue in the colony, and one reason why it's unsafe at night and people don't want to like be outdoors and so on. So, and that like how that combines and that how that compounds is something else. I was in a conversation recently, and something like that somebody, just in terms of banality, like somebody also pointed out, like what you're looking at is not also necessarily just heat, but you actually need to be looking at heat in combination with noise in a lot of other contexts, and how that increases irritability. If somebody is stuck in traffic, for example, for a very long time, which happens in cities like ours, just the pervasiveness of noise and like how that compounds irritability that you might be experiencing from increased temperature anyway. So there are some like maybe starting points, but not something that we have more systematically done yet. Thanks.
Santosh?
I have many questions, but I can deal with it later or maybe let other people. Some observations and some questions. I was really struck by what happened 2-3 decades when I left India. Still, it's the same story. We still used to have evaporation technologies, sprinkling water on the mud floor or sitting under the shades, and it's still the same story in informal settings in New Delhi or in Hyderabad or in any other city. It seems like nothing has changed. My question is, and I tell you, I work on migration, I work on gender as well, and you will see where the question is coming from, particularly your observation about the gender. You talked about the risks, unequal distribution, I totally agree, but also the response is very gendered based, and it's not only heat, whatever you take, any disaster, tsunami happened, women are not part of the decision making. They are the ones who are facing the consequences, putting the food on the table, but then any response they don't take of their privacy, their sanitation, and all other needs. And it is not only in one, every policy, they are absent. While they are responsible, not only the women's labor, the physically demanding things that they are collecting the water, but also the home-based work, basically household survival. But again, totally, we don't take them into account. Not only that, also they're creating climate knowledge production, how they are adapting, very important thing. So I'm just thinking about, you talked about community-led adaptation mechanisms. How do you see that within the broader climate justice discourse that basically, I'm thinking about what are the risks and possibilities of relying on community agencies in the absence of institutional support, particularly when there is legal dimension into that. They are the illegal people who, not illegal people, but people living, they do not have the houses. This relates to the wider issues of house, electricity, water, so it's a much more complex things. My second thing is you started with that not fitting that within disaster framework because it's happening, it's not in one-off event. What other frameworks would you suggest? I think because I work on health, it's the similar sort of thing, but I particularly like the rights approach. But again, I don't know whether you can fit within the right-based framework. I'm not sure about this. I had one more question, but anyway, I'll leave it on to here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Just maybe responding to the second question first. I don't think I'm necessarily arguing against a disaster framing per se. Right? I think it's important that it actually be getting it recognized as a disaster itself has taken quite a lot of mobilization, and it's like still is very selective in terms of when heat gets recognized as a disaster or not. And there's a few different reasons behind it. Like one, if it gets recognized as a disaster, then people need to be compensated, right? And so that's first, right? And even that necessarily by itself wouldn't be so limiting, but it's also in some ways an intractable problem, right? If you recognize it as a disaster, then it is also incumbent upon you to do something about it, right? And yet it is not clear what exactly to do about it, right? And so and so there's hesitation, even to call it a disaster, and when it gets called a disaster. But it does mobilize resources in a way that wouldn't be otherwise. And one reason you actually do at least see the recognition of heat as a problem in the first place is because the National Disaster Management Authority was an early kind of institution that took up the issue, right? The challenge is one in how disaster itself is conceptualized, and there was a lot of disaster studies folks who talk about it, to move the discussion away from disaster as an acute kind of event to thinking about disaster as having longer temporal and spatial horizons. But I mean, the other thing, which also you all picked up on, right? From the perspective of public health, for instance, it's not really nearly as immediate or as urgent a challenge, right? So there have to be other kind of institutional kind of linkages in order for it to truly be getting the kind of attention that it does, right? For public health, there is far more immediate and urgent challenges, which means that this often takes a backseat. Right? And so that's, I guess that's the kind of discussion I would like to see to have. And that particular disconnect between disaster and public health, again, is not unique to heat. It's not unique to India. That's something that a lot of people do talk about. I'm not entirely sure of your second question, the first question that you had. Are you asking what is the risk of a community-led approach, or
yeah, in the absence of institutional support and
right.
legality in the context of gender?
Right. So, I suppose at least what is very obvious in this context for us is the centrality of women. When we are talking about community, even for there to be a community and there to be a sense of place at all in this context, and women are quite central to that articulation. And so I don't think there's a risk in which you can think about community as potentially erasing or not being sensitive or attentive to the specific ways in which the community itself is structured and works. But that's also where a more granular and more place-based kind of approach to even understanding what community is and then how to instantiate community-led response means. At the level of the city, it is less obvious. The city is quite sensitive to one, loss of life is always quite politically quite contentious, and it's something that people would like to avoid as much as possible, right? So if we can make legality notwithstanding, like it's not about like whether people have access to land or not, like that's a separate question in some ways that can be bracketed, right? And which is why certain kinds of solutions are more attractive than others, certain kind of interventions would make more sense than others. But I don't think it is politically impossible to actually have that discussion and move the conversation in a way that gives greater kind of authority and greater decision-making capacity, that places greater decision-making capacity within communities. The standard approaches have either been market-led or state-led, and partly what we have been trying to work towards is like, can we think about it as being community-led in addition to, like not instead of, but in addition to like state or market-led interventions.
Thank you so much. Yes, Alok, that we've run out of time, but that were really fantastic discussant comments and really great questions. And yeah, let's just thank